Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and welcome to this week's strategic webcast from Schiller Institute founder and president Helga Zepp-LaRouche. There's a breaking situation in the U.S., Helga, that's really quite astonishing, and I think it's just worth noting that now that the British are finally coming into focus, the role of the British in setting up the whole operation against the Trump presidency, that you and your husband back in November and December of 2016, when it was just beginning, emphasized that if this is going to be stopped, it has to be by going after the British role, not just for running the operation, but what was being protected by trying to knock out Trump. So this is something that I think you have the latest developments. Why don't you give us this picture?
Yeah, I think the plot is thickening, as they say. Actually, the story is really unbelievable, and I'm quite proud that I wrote an article at the very beginning of this affair where I said there is collusion with the British and not with Russia. And that is exactly what is now coming out, and it's becoming a subject, in the public domain. So maybe I start with the case against Steele, which was supposed to be tried in a London court, in a high court in London. Steele was supposed to appear, and then in the last minute was represented by his lawyer. And the argument was that this could touch British national security interest. And lo and behold, a representative of the Foreign Office also was there, and their lawyers, and they stated the same thing. So the role of the British government, the British intelligence, is now a subject, and it is quite clear that Christopher Steele was not some random former MI6 agent, but that he was indeed an asset of not only the British, but also the FBI. I mean, this point has come out in a very interesting article in the web page or web blog by Pat Lang, Sic Semper Tyrannis, where he asks under the headline, "Did British intelligence try to destroy the Trump presidency?" Which is exactly what we are looking at. And Pat Lang, for those people who don't know him, he's a senior, very respected intelligence official in the United States, not at all some Russian or some other source which might be questioned in this context. But he's a senior, I think he worked for the CIA for a long time, or military, I don't know exactly, but he's very respected. In any case, he points to the fact that the new memos, which have come out by Senator Grassley and Senator Graham, and the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Commission, that they all corroborate what is in the Nunes memorandum. And indeed, there are a lot of new aspects. They imply that maybe Comey lied under oath, because, when he gave the famous press conference exonerating Hillary Clinton, he claimed that he had not coordinated that with anybody else. Now, that is in stark contradiction to some more texts which were exchanged between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, two FBI officials who were involved both in the email affair of Hillary Clinton and also in Russiagate. And they basically indicate in these messages that Hillary knew that there would be no charge against her. So that needs further investigation. Then another very ominous fact has appeared, and that is another text exchange between these two, where they say on the 2nd of September 2016 that POTUS, that is the president of the United States, namely Obama, wanted to know everything they are doing. Now, what is this everything referring to? Because at that point, the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails was already concluded, and the second investigation only started on the 28th of September. So there is a very big likelihood that this everything refers to Russiagate. And that means that Obama is now directly tied, not only indirectly through the payment of GPS fusion and steel, where the Obama administration also paid together with the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. So this is all extremely, extremely hot. And, there are now all these Senate and congressional hearings and commissions investigating this. Congressman Nunes, who had, published this memo, or President Trump had agreed to publishing Nunes this memos last Friday. He said this was only phase one. There are more phases to come, and they will involve, among other things, the State Department, and that naturally then also involves Victoria Nuland, whose name has come up now. And there was also, on another matter, an exchange, or many exchanges, between Christopher Steele and Victoria Nuland in respect to the coup in the Ukraine, the famous Maidan coup. So this is all very, very interesting, very hot. The Russiagate is practically dead letter, but what is now instead on the table is the meddling of the British government, the British intelligence, in the election in the United States, trying to sabotage the Trump victory first, and when he was winning, nevertheless, to destroy the Trump presidency with a completely fabricated accusation. Now, this is now out in the open, and this is big, and I can still only be absolutely shocked and surprised, even though this is going on for some time, how the mainstream Western media manage not to cover this, what is clearly reaching dimensions which go far, far beyond Watergate.
Well, what you see from the media and from the anti-Trump forces are screams of protest. And in fact, it's interesting. They took the word that was used originally to describe Russiagate, that is a Nothingburger, to try to attribute that to Nunes's report saying it's a Nothingburger. But the fact that you heard nothing but Nothingburger, Nothingburger, Nothingburger shows you they're coordinating a response where they have nothing else to say. So it's a Nothingburger about a Nothingburger. Now, I think the other thing that's important, Helga, is that from the Washington Post article, which came out, I guess, 2 days ago, they identified the key role of Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6 and a great supporter of Steele. This, combined with the Foreign Office showing up yesterday in court to protect him, makes it unmistakably clear that this is the high-level British intelligence operation.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the article by Pat Lang, which I just mentioned, pointed to redacted or places in the memo which were redacted and some which were not redacted. And he, being an intelligence profi, points to the fact that there is a reference to a clause called FD 1023, which is an FBI form which documents debriefings of FBI sources. And he points to the fact that this was meant, obviously, that Steele was in some kind of a source function to the FBI, and that questions naturally, did his superiors know? If not, this may cause big legal problems for Christopher Steele to work for a foreign intelligence, being a so-called former MI6 agent himself, but more likely, naturally, that it was with collusion or with approval, or actually with direction of MI6 directly. And the fact that Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, absolutely defended the reputation of Steele is very interesting in this respect, because who is this Dearlove? He is the infamous author of the famous dossier which led to the attack on Iraq in the Second Gulf War, supposedly because Saddam Hussein was in the possession of weapons of mass destruction, which we know was a blatant lie, which led Colin Powell to make this infamous speech in the United Nations, which he later characterized as the biggest mistake of his life, because it led to the intervention, including the United States in the war against Saddam Hussein, and there are recent studies which I think need to be mentioned, that in the last 27 years, since this second Iraq war, every day 329 people have died in that region between Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and so forth. Now that is, something which eventually must be also tried. And I know that Ramsey Clark, at a certain point, tried to make that an issue in front of the international legal authorities. So, this is not just an attempt of a coup against the United States, but this is a paradigm of policies which have led to the present condition in the world, including the destruction of much of Southwest Asia, including the refugee crisis. So these are not small things, and I think it is high time that this whole paradigm comes out in the open and is being replaced by a completely different policy.
I think the other thing that's important now is we're beginning to see the role that the media is playing coming out in a totally blatant way. There was an op-ed column in the Washington Post saying that Trump will learn to fear the FBI the way other presidents have, referencing what Hoover did to J. Edgar Hoover to blackmail presidents. And why does he think he can take on these secret services? The other irony here was pointed out by the famous author David Garrow, that why is it that liberals are cheering the deep state? I think you had a chance to see the Garrow report. What's the importance of this in terms of just holding a mirror up in front of the so-called progressive movement in the United States?
Well, and the left and the liberals in Europe as well. This Garrow, the author of the biography about Martin Luther King, points out to that the predecessors of these same Democrats in the Congress, they did not side with the FBI, but they were siding with the civil rights movement at the time. And in the 70s, there was the Church Commission, which brought out all of these activities, and the Democrats today are covering up for it. And he says the reason is obviously such a partisan hatred against Trump, which makes these people blind against what is going on. Now, I think this will lead to a big, crisis of identity, because I don't think that everybody will fall for this. And the more voices come out and point to the fact, as Paul Craig Roberts did, who said that if these people would win out, the United States would become a complete police dictatorship under the control of the secret services. And who would want that? So I think that the stakes here are extremely high. And I think people should really rethink everything and look at the material which is coming out, because it is an unbelievable scandal.
And one other footnote on the media, you now have John Brennan, the murderous former CIA director, who's just been hired to be a commentator on NBC, and then a top aide to Comey hired by CNN. I mean, this is somewhat unprecedented, wouldn't you say?
Well, we knew that from the former GDR. That was something called the Black Channel, and people knew what is a state-controlled media, but that it's happening in the United States now in this open fashion should give people another food for thought.
Now, the other thing people have to look at is the escalation, which we started talking about 2 weeks ago, of the attacks on China. This is reaching a kind of fevered pitch with Marco Rubio, this think tank in Germany, Merix. This is pretty extensive, and I think you should just give people a sense of how wild this is.
Well, it seems to be an internationally coordinated attack on China and the new Silk Road. For example, the Australian intelligence, they put out a report saying that China was an extreme threat to national security of Australia. Then you had the commander of the Pacific, Harris, who said that China was a disturbing factor in the Indo-Pacific region, a disruptor. Then the European Council of Foreign Relations had a report attacking the Chinese policy. And then you have this study, so-called by Merix, this German think tank, together with Global Public Policy Institute, which is situated in New York. And when you read this report, which I did, it is very clear that they are really completely freaked out about the fact that China is winning and the West is losing. I mean, they have, it's almost, if it wouldn't have such severe strategic consequences, it's almost amusing, because they find noteworthy or questionable, or they criticize the fact that, for example, the Greek Minister President Tsipras attended the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing and praised China and the new Silk Road. What a crime! Or that President Zeman of the Czech Republic invited Xi Jinping for a state visit. What a crime! Or that the 16+1 Central and Eastern European countries are very happy to cooperate with the new Silk Road, because it provides them with the kind of infrastructure investment which the EU did not provide. And then they call all of this, they say that the Chinese policy of the new Silk Road puts into question the fundamental assumptions about the role of Europe on the world stage. Well, I mean, I really couldn't help than smiling, because, it is true. China is offering a different system. And there was just a response to all of these things in the Global Times, where they say that what is behind the China threat story is the fact that China indeed is proposing a different way for the development of human society. And they are proud saying it, and it's true. They have a very different conception. I find it also quite remarkable that a high-ranking bishop of the Curia in Rome, the Vatican, the head of the Academy of Sciences, basically praised China. He was just on a trip in China negotiating, church matters between the Catholic Church in China and the Vatican, and he came back and said how wonderful is what China is doing, that China is the best representation of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, that you don't find ghettos, you don't find youth in drugs, you find people working, and that this would be in cohesion with what St. Paul said, that if you want to eat, you should work, and that the high moral standards are an example. So he went out of his way praising what he saw in China. Now that I find quite amusing, because it's true. So China is offering a different model of development. They have the idea of overcoming poverty, of offering the Chinese model of success to every other country without imposing their values. They are perfectly happy to accept different social systems. And I have studied Chinese history off and on for more than 40 years. And I have come to the conclusion that the idea to accuse China of imperialism is just completely out of any proportion, because China is absolutely an example of accepting the sovereignty of the other country. And they have made that the absolute fundament of the policy of the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is why it is so successful. So in this article in the Global Times, they say that all of this China bashing will not prevent the West from failing, and that some Westerners rather see the West fail than agreeing and accepting the fact that the East is rising.
Well, and there's a profound irony here, which is that the people who are accusing China of imperial policies are the same ones who are pushing a containment policy against Russia and China, the encirclement of Russia and China, military buildup. This is the old geopolitics. The irony here is that while they're doing this and risking war, you see China making great progress with Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and also Latin America. I think there was a very significant development out of Latin America just in the last couple of days.
Yes, the Secretary of State Tillerson, in a speech in Austin, in the university there, had accused China of imperial policies in Latin America. And that followed the very successful meeting between China and the CELAC countries, the Latin American and Caribbean countries. So he accused China of imperial motives. Now, it's quite good and interesting that the times where such frivolous statements would go uncommented are obviously over, because a whole series of ambassadors from Latin American countries all came out individually, absolutely refuting this, saying no, their country is cooperating economically with China completely on their own by free will, that it's very advantageous for both sides, and basically totally refuting what Tillerson said. So I think this is very good because, here is a strategic initiative which, if it would be accepted by the United States and by European nations, you would have a platform for peace. If you have a win-win cooperation on a global scale, well, I think that is the way how we can create a platform for a peace and security doctrine for the 21st century. And I think that needs more debate. And I would hope that there are more people speaking out like these Latin American ambassadors, because that's exactly what we need. We need a real international discourse about the different models of policy, and they should be, done in a democratic, free spirit where people can speak what they think according to the First Amendment of the American Constitution. And you should have a free dialogue. What are the merits of which system? And I think that would really be very healthy for the whole world.
Helga, in the interest of starting that dialogue, I'd like you to comment on the relationship between financial crisis and the war danger, because we've seen a series of shock effects this week from the stock markets. The bubbles are, whether this is the big crash or not is still to be determined, but the bubbles are set for a crash, although you have Mario Draghi, the head of the European Central Bank, saying he sees no bubbles. But the war danger and the financial crisis seem to always march in common. And I think it would be very helpful for people if you discussed why that's the case.
Well, first of all, I think we are sitting on the edge of a new financial crash, which could become much, much worse than that of 2008. Therefore, what Draghi said is just completely absurd. And the only explanation why he would say something like that is that he must be in a bubble, which prevents him to see the world as it is. There was a report by the German Banking Association, however, where they warn indeed of many dangers. The overall international debt. You had this relatively big shake-up on Friday where the markets lost 666 points. On Monday, it was 1,203 points. And in only a few days, the nominal value of $4 trillion was just wiped out from the electronic accounting. So it's not yet the big crash, but it's a precursor of what could happen at any moment. And I think that the relation to the dangers of war is that the powers to be, Wall Street, the City of London, the military-industrial complex, they people who believe that their privileges are entirely based on the system of maximum profit seeking, of becoming richer with each wave of quantitative easing, with really manipulation of the book values. Because what is it else if a firm takes a credit at zero interest and then buys their own stocks and they all are richer? But in reality, this is then only helping and serving a very small fraction of the population, which become richer and richer. Now, these people are obviously the same ones who are behind the Russiagate, behind the idea that Trump must be prevented by all means from cooperating with Russia and China. These are the people who are for the beefing up of NATO troops at the Russian border, who are basically, risking geopolitical confrontations all the time. I mean, that their policies are not working, and that, all these sanctions and NATO expansion and so forth has not led to the demise of Putin nor the demise of Xi Jinping, obviously does not deter them. But I think, it is really therefore all the more important that the only solution to this financial crisis, namely the implementation of the Glass-Steagall banking separation, the 4 laws developed by my husband, Lyndon LaRouche, that they come on the table, and that there is really an effort by the populations of all countries to demand that their governments respond to Xi Jinping's offer of cooperating with the new Silk Road. I mean, both Europe, Germany, Italy, France, the United States, they are all in urgent need for an improvement and modernization of infrastructure. There is plenty of work to do, joint ventures in reconstructing the Middle East after these wars of destruction. There is an urgent need for everybody to cooperate in the industrialization of Africa if the refugee crisis is supposed to be solved in a human way. So therefore, what we really need is a public mobilization and a public discussion, how can these dangers be avoided? And I think that we are very close to a solution. I think we are, the new paradigm already exists. It would be very easy for the Western countries to, give up their idea of geopolitical manipulation and just cooperate on an equal footing with Russia and China. And, that is, for anybody who is interested in world peace, the only way out of this crisis.
And on this question of war and peace, we have the beginning of the Winter Olympics in South Korea, which may be the scene of some interesting developments.
Well, it is not yet quite clear. I think between the two Koreas, it goes very well, because the sister of Kim Jong-un is participating. So is the head of the government of North Korea, Kim Jong-nam. So there is a very high level delegation of North Korea participating. And one can be pretty sure that between them and the South Korean leadership, there will be absolute good discussions. However, Pence, the vice president of the United States, unfortunately didn't find a better moment than to demand a hardening of the sanctions against North Korea, rather than using this moment of relative thaw to try to move things forward. And naturally, North Korea immediately answered with a military parade and said that they are not going to talk to the Americans. Well, this is very unfortunate, but let's see how this process between the two Koreas develops. It's a hopeful moment from that standpoint.
I expect to hear from the neocons any time now that they're considering the North Korean women's hockey team participation has to do with hockey sticks as a dual-use weapon or something. Helga, just to conclude the discussion, I want to come back to the importance of the breakthrough from the congressional memos of the focus on the British. What should people around the world be doing to make sure that this not just continues, but succeeds in breaking the power of this group of coup plotters?
Well, I think one thing would be naturally the spreading of the dossier, which was published by LaRouche PEC, written by Barbara Boyd. This was written half a year ago, but if you read this dossier now, it is absolutely incredible how absolutely on the mark this dossier was concerning the role of British intelligence. So I think the circulation of this dossier is something which everybody can do very easily. Get it in the social media, get it in the alternative blogs, get it into any newspaper which has the honesty to follow events in a truthful way. And right now things are coming out in the open. There were articles by Ray McGovern, by William Binney, Pat Lang, by Russia Today. Naturally, they pick up on the fact that Russiagate is now completely fallen apart. So I think the more people can do to get the public attention to what is going on in this absolutely gigantic fight in the United States, the better, because some of these spooks shy the daylight, and the more sun is shining on them, all the better.
Well, and this is the opportunity to put an end to the dangerous doctrine of geopolitics, which of course was invented by the British. So Helga, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, goodbye.